And then once we got to be civilized, as she says here,
Oh, civilized.
yeah.
That's pretty
Yeah.
ironic, isn't it? Civilized.
But got into be, you know, we started to do agriculture, and we started to circle around a village and then a city and so forth. We then had power structures, and that changed things.
And we needed, later in this assigned reading for this week, he talks about the need to create a mythological group or power
Yes.
structure. He draws on Yuval Harari's books in that regard, which is a lot about imagined mythological structure groups and ideas like money.
Yeah.
What is
I read that. Well, not that one, but the Yuval Harari Sapiens, which
Yes.
he touches on that at the beginning of this book a lot. And it is a lot of the same theme at the beginning.
Yeah.
I haven't read that one yet. I gotta write that one down.
So there, you listen to any kind of national ideology and you hear vague concepts that are kind of presented as this is what binds us together, like freedom, liberty, democracy. These are big words, and that's a lot. Those are big words, but it's a lot to hold a country together based on those three words. Or if it's national identity, religious identity, if you dig beneath the surface of any of those words or identities, there's a great deal of variety that begins to tear apart. And Harari says, without those words and without those concepts, the nation state or the religion can really start to fall apart. And that's why it's so necessary to believe in these abstract concepts. Like money, what is money? Money is just what
A way to collect taxes, right? A way for the little people to give their taxes to the people in charge. I mean, that's how it originated. Right?
Well, and the whole concept that we have money in the bank, that money's not in the bank. The bank has their money in there, you know, it's like, what is the movie, the Christmas movie with
It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, It's a Wonderful Life. Yeah.
Oh, right.
You go looking for the money, you know, the money's not there. The money's out in the community, you know, doing good. It's like, what do you mean my money's not in the bank? Well, that's what money is. Well, what is money? It's a fiction. It's a fiction we all have to believe in, though, for it to work.
It's kind of interesting, though, how we're getting down the road. So one of the words that maybe ties this nation right together is liberty. And yet the definition of liberty to the factions of people in the country is quite different. So like you were saying, Jeffrey, if you get underneath it, people attach their own meaning to liberty. And then, you know, it starts to get a little sideways.
Yeah. And other national symbols like the flag, no matter what country it is, it's supposed to bring people together, and it does. And without such symbols, there would be no sense of national unity. And yet you interview people about what a flag means, you'll get a lot of different responses.
Whoa.
Lots of
Particularly today.
Yeah, yeah, anytime. Likewise, you know, all Christians are supposed to believe generally the same thing. Yeah, until you start really asking people what to believe.
Yeah.
Then you come away from it saying, do we really believe anything in common?
Back to your original question about balance. I'm trying to think, did he have any balance for the babies who, if they liked string beans better than graham crackers, and their puppet was a string bean, even though their puppet did bad things, they liked that puppet better. Did he have any kind of balance for that? I don't remember that he did.
Yeah, that starts on 209, his conversation here about baby research and research.
It said the babies have a preference for good. And that's where on many of these things, I had a big, you know, like, here's the thing he thinks. And then there was the big but. So the babies had morality, they had a preference for good, but they gravitated towards like-minded too, and had an aversion to the unfamiliar. So even though they liked it, they didn't like things that were not familiar to them.
Just like,
And if they were the string bean people, they cheered on the string bean puppet, regardless of what the string bean puppet did.
Yeah.
That's hard to, I mean, was there a balance for that? I think that's kind of at the crux of, what he envisions and hopes for, that there has to be some kind of balance for that.
But then he moved into empathy, that, so he got into, yes, the problem is you have group identity, but there is, where does the empathy go? As you get larger and larger groups, it's harder to have empathy en masse, but you've got to break it down to the individual. So the more that you can, the less generalization, the more individual, the more empathy can be felt.
I thought what he's saying here is summarized at the top of 17. And Christy, I don't know what page that is on the audiobook.
Yeah.
He says the
somewhere
sad
between
truth.
the ice rink and the soccer field. I'm kidding.
The sad truth is that empathy and xenophobia go hand in hand. They're two sides.
Yeah. Mhm.
So what brings us together in group unity then causes us to say, yeah, we're okay, but that group over there, they can't possibly have what we have here. Which kind of makes conflict inevitable. Unless we just keep expanding our groups and saying, well, that group really isn't so different from my group.
Or if we get to know each other.
You know, what occurred to me as I was reading today and looking back on it is how important foreign exchange student programs were when I was growing up. What a big difference it made in my family. And maybe other people grew up in the time I grew up in, when it was the first time in the post-war era when Americans went and spent considerable amount of time in countries like Iran, even in Bolivia, and way beyond our European comfort zones. And then we welcomed people from Japan and all kinds of places. And so we had a Japanese student, 1972-73, stay at our house for a year.
Mhm.
And, you think of 1972-73, that wasn't long after World War II. And there were a lot of people who fought in World War II and remembered Pearl Harbor and so on. And then to have a Japanese student with them, I know for my father, it kind of made him look at Japanese people completely differently. Because of course he had been not in the war, but very much alive at that time when the Japanese were our sworn enemies. And here, not too many years later, a Japanese boy was living in our house. I think those kinds of experiences just kind of they challenge the xenophobia part of our empathy. They challenge it with empathy. And I remember when our Japanese student left, my father was in tears because he had grown so attached to this kid. He could no longer have any feelings of animosity.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
I remember one time when we were going to Japan and I worked at the senior center, and there were some men who had been in the war. And one of them, I think, had been on the Enola Gay. And he said, I can never forgive those Japs. And I just, oh my gosh. But that was a generation and that was an experience that he had. And there's no way of getting rid of that feeling. So except had he got to know them as your father did with the Japanese boy, how beautiful. That's sort of the answer, isn't it? We have to get to know each other. There's this group, do you
Very
all
much
know
so.
about Hands of Peace?
Yeah.
That brings Palestinian and Israeli kids together in America every summer.
Yeah. Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Right.
Yeah, I find that too when we travel, it sort of brings you to there. There are so it gives you an idea of the scope of how large just the world is, our on this planet people, and there are many, many different people who have all the same hopes and dreams and concerns that we have. But I think, so how do you bring that same feeling down in a micro way to what's going on, even in the United States, for what it's like, if you live in a state that you don't travel much, or you don't get out, or you don't see people. How do you develop that empathy in that?
One thing I found interesting about being here in Polo, Illinois, which is population 2,200, and we're surrounded by cornfields and soybeans. It's harvest time. I had a preconceived notion that they would be very insular and not well traveled. I can't tell you how many people I have met who have traveled internationally, who have worked internationally, who continue to work internationally. We're on lockdown now, and also through Rotary International, who had foreign exchange students in their homes. And someone down the block from me has a foreign exchange student in her home right now. I really thought that was wonderful.
It's really interesting to hear you say, Diane. I have farm relatives who I adore up just over the border in Wisconsin. And I feel like their community is anything but well-traveled. And sadly, they have prejudices and opinions that reflect that. But they're cherished relatives. I mean, I adore them. So,
Jane, we need to talk more about that. Sorry, Christy, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I just was gonna say, like, the international piece is definitely one that we should talk about. But even just like as a mother, I worry about like raising my kids right now. They're like basically living, in their bedrooms, working on Zooms and all of that. And like creating touch points with real people is like my goal, because even the news they're getting is the news that the big machine thinks they want to hear, and they're hearing their own stories, and they're not getting out and interacting. They're not coming to church, or they're not meeting with people who might have different views. And so the kids today, we just see them becoming so much more siloed in what they are experiencing and what they think, and they just perpetually aren't out there. They're like not thrown into these situations where they might be in a classroom and have a discussion with somebody who disagrees with them, because they're not there. So it's more and more challenging in our generations that are coming up. I think we're really going to have issues.
Yeah, an echo chamber.
I'm astounded that you're even able to get on this call, Christy, looking at our kids and our grandkids who are 10, 11, 12 years old. I mean, they're swamped with just keeping attentions to the screens.
Yeah.
But the thing we have to remember in terms of COVID and the silo that you're feeling right now is it's not going to last forever. It's going to be a blip in their lives, but one that they will tell their grandchildren about, I'm sure.
Yeah.
You all carry on. I'm still trying to get Jan into the call here.
And the facts, that you think you're reading, maybe people who don't have the same views are getting completely different facts and different feeds, and they feel like they're
really true.
They're getting like they're like we're being fed information that the computers think we want to hear. So like you may be getting whatever feeds, and they may be getting different feeds or seeing different channels or whatever, and you are listening just for what is important to you. And so we're not like following the other sides or seeing, and so we just keep getting further and further apart. So I think that's really we sat our kids down and made them watch it this weekend, because a lot of the moms around are thinking that was really important, and it was really good.
The Social Dilemma, how did you get it?
It's on Netflix. It's
Streaming?
it's all, yeah.
Is it a
I
movie?
watched-
Social
I watched
Dilemma?
it too. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, it's like an hour and a half. It's basically all these people who've left, who started working in social media. So they're from Apple, Google, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those, and they left for moral reasons. And they are
Wow.
telling the story of why. And they're explaining to you, the watcher, like what's going on. When you're on Facebook, what's actually happening behind that.
Ooh,
Sort of
that
goes into
sounds really good.
Yeah. It kind of
Yeah.
goes into the power thing that he gets into around, you know, people tell a story and they convince you to believe it in order to maintain power. So if these channels are built around certain kinds of propaganda, so that's being fed in a channel, and it's about keeping power, that's
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
very divisive.
Yep.
Yeah, and we're like, I think fundamentally people are good, right? Like that's what we're learning here. So why do fundamentally good people like completely argue about what the right course of action is? It's just, it's so hard, but you take the facts that matter to whatever you are, and you know, you hold tight to them. Maybe it's the empathy, right? Like that we were talking about. You surround yourself with like-minded people and really try, but you know, it's so hard to come to the table and talk.
Mhm.
And the people who have different opinions than me, I guess one thing that's helping me is to remind myself, okay, they are at this point in their life with these beliefs and these perspectives for a number of reasons, just as I am.
Mhm.
And we talk about all these topics and they're so complex. They're not only two sides of the coin, it's multifaceted.
Yeah.
To all these things.
Mhm.
Let's dig into this chapter on power a little bit. He's seeming, I think he's trying to say, again, there's a mismatch between what's in our deepest DNA and then how society works today.
Mhm.
He says that in more primal societies, it's the friendliest who get promoted, the survival of the friendliest.
Mhm.
And he also seems to say that among leaders, there tend to be more narcissists, egomaniacs, opportunists, and sociopaths. And whether that's kind of the nature of the system to promote people who are less empathetic, or is it that friendly people can become, it's what he calls acquired sociopathy.
That was frightening.
The
Yeah.
idea that it can kind of go to your head, go to your brain,
Yeah.
and power can become a drug. He uses that phrase.
Mhm.
Power makes you feel superior, he says on page 227.
Mhm.
Does this describe anybody you know?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Many
They start-
executives I knew.
They started
You've
out
been there, Jean.
Yeah.
not friendly enough, and then something happened.
Yeah.
What happened to these nice people? I mean, we do.
Well, I think some of it was power, but I also think some of it was pressure to be within, you know, as you move up within a certain structure, you get more and more power to conform to the structure and more responsibility then to keep the conformation in order to, because you're responsible for the people who are working below you. You know, it's sort of a catch-22 for many leaders. There are some, like he was saying, I think that are lean more towards sociopath, and they're all about my, me, my, but there are many who end up in those positions for doing a good job and wanting to support their own family, but then they start to feel responsible for all these other things too, and then gets into that thing where he talked about they compromise the bonuses, you know, they compromise the morality, and they start to justify doing things that, you know, they probably wouldn't have in the past.
But even that sense of responsibility of being in charge of your company and how it does and how all of your employees, I can see how that could undermine your sense of playfulness. And so, our executive in the, I don't think he would like me using that word, or whatever he is in the healthcare system in, is that Holland or Denmark? That we had the head of the very thriving healthcare system who was
Yeah.
like, hey, do what seems good and right to you. And
D Block,
say it again.
D Block, DEBLOK.
In the
Okay.
Netherlands, yeah.
Okay, in Holland then. So I can see though how coming to be, in a powerful position in a corporation can really undermine your sense of just being playful and letting things kind of go the way other people think they should go, because you're the one who's in charge and you're the one who's ultimately responsible for, do those Boeing planes stay up? And if you aren't somewhat dictatorial, your company can fail. And, people can die because you.
I disagree.
Okay, good.
You don't have to be dictatorial to be a good leader, right? It's kind of a continuum in my mind. There are dictatorial people who dictate, here's what needs to be done. And then there are other leaders who facilitate and enable the people who know how to do their jobs. And I say it's a continuum because I've worked with and met people all, at different phases there. So you don't have to be, you don't have to dictate.
I think I
I
would
think-
agree with that.
Yeah, I think though you can't be totally laissez-faire and let it go. I don't know.
True. I mean, there are certain people who have rights to make certain decisions, and others have the ability to influence those decisions.
I think that's one of the reasons we see with a lot of leaders, like issues with delegation. They often aren't able to delegate as well as we would hope. They maybe don't have the complete ability to say, yep, I trust you, handle it. They're more like, okay, well, but run it by me first.
I don't know how this fits into the book, but I've worked with a few truly insufferable autocrats in my life.
Mhm.
What I've noticed is what seems to be self-confidence is really jelly-like insecurity down deep.
Mhm.
That drives them to more and more extremely dictatorial, controlling behaviors. I don't know how this fits into Bregman's book, but it's my observation of, and people begin to fear them, and they stay in the system only out of fear, and it becomes miserable for everybody, and ultimately a system can collapse with that kind of a leader. But I don't think it's driven by a motivation other than to try to masquerade one's deepest fear of self-doubt and a sense of worthlessness.
Or to lose power, because lose power would confirm that sense of worthlessness.
It takes a confident person to trust others, right? And that person has to be able to coach, not just, as someone said, be laissez-faire, completely hands off.
There's an interesting thing, I think, and though these, we were talking about so many things were covered, but the other part of so many things being covered here is that, it sort of goes back and forth to the pendulum, the swinging. So, yes, then there's a lot of power, but the people find ways to balance the power through revolutions or this, and then this kind of happens and this happens. I thought it was interesting how he was able to say, you know, there are examples, to your point, Nancy, on both sides of things that happen, particularly when you got into the Enlightenment part of how, you know, here's what Enlightenment got right, but oh, here's what Enlightenment maybe missed out on. Because one of the issues of, you know, bonuses or incentives or those kinds of things is you always get unintended consequences. And then the system, you know, it can't be totally predicted. So it goes the way it's going to go. And then you have to manage whatever those unintended consequences or results are.
Before that, he uses another phrase, survival of the shameless.
Yeah.
Again, that leaders, that most people are capable of feeling shame. And that's a good thing because it keeps us in check. It keeps us in touch with people that we might hurt and makes us question our behaviors that contributed to another person's injury. But the higher a person gets into an institution, you have to have some callousness toward other people's feelings and the consequences of your own decisions. Because as George W. Bush once said, you know, I'm the decider. You know, when you get to be at a high level of in an institution, you have to make decisions that are going to make somebody unhappy, unhappy on their own and unhappy with you. And that's inevitable. And so you only get promoted to those high positions the degree to which you're able to psychologically withstand within your own self that sense of disappointment that other people have on their own and with you. He calls it the survival of the shameless. And yet there's some sense of shame in everybody. And that's why when people want to make social change, sometimes they have to point to the moral misstep of the leadership and say, shame, shame, shame on you. Look what you're doing. I'm thinking here of Saul Alinsky, who some of you may know that name, or if you don't, it's okay. He's the founder of sort of modern community organizing. And his idea was that when people want to make change, you need to go at the heart of the people who have power. And you need to gather people together and basically saying, look what you're doing to us. Look what you're doing to the environment. It is morally wrong. And you're trying to shame them basically into changing their mind and changing their policy. This is community organizers like Barack Obama and others were trained to do. Basically, get all your friends together and go and change the state representative or the governor until they feel such shame that they capitulate and do what you want.
Now, Brene Brown, that's interesting. She's a shame researcher. I don't know if you all are familiar with her. And I have been listening to her work in line with the racism, right? And her thing is, you can't shame people to be better. That it goes to that intrinsic piece then that he comes back to. You can hold them accountable for what you want. So being held accountable for racism and experiencing shame for the way you participated in it is not the same as being shamed for being racist. I'm trying to understand my notes here. So you can't shame people to be better. The idea is you're a good person and you told a lie. You can be ashamed for telling the lie, but you are, if you say you are a liar, that's shaming someone.
Thank you. Community organizing, you're trying to say, go ahead.
Pardon?
I was going to say that's a basic mothering tact. You know, when one of the kids does something wrong, I say, listen, you are not a bad person, but you did not do a good thing here.
Right.
You know, we know that from experience, right?
Shaming sounds like you're trying to bring a person down, but actually you're trying to appeal to their, what you hope is a moral core. And to say, you know, we're on the right side of history here. we want you to be on our side because we think it's the right side of history. It's the right side of what good and decent people should do and believe. Will you join us? And until you don't, I guess we'll have to assume that that your values are opposed to these good and decent values that lead us to this request. But you're appealing to the heart as much as to the head when you're trying to change the view of a public official in community organizing. And a quick example, it actually worked. The church I served in Arlington Heights, I think I may have told you this story. We were trying to get our state rep to endorse a bill that would seal the offenses, low-level felony offenses of people who would be seeking employment when they get out of prison. And we went straight to his heart by saying, that we know you go to church and you must believe in a God of second chances and that people can change. And that when they get out of prison, they need a chance to get their foot in the door with an interview when they get work. And, we appealed right to his core values as a way of saying, and if you don't agree with Jesus, what kind of person are you? And then it touched something in him, and he started to tell a story about a worker at his family's business who was a convicted felon, but they had to fire her because the insurance company would bond her.
Oh,
And he said, I guess if I can do something to make her path smoother, and it's what Jesus wants, and it's what all you nice church people want, I guess I want to be on your side.
wow.
And he co-sponsored,
done.
he co-sponsored this legislation. It became
Wow.
bipartisan legislation. So, that's the idea behind kind of shaming people into
Yeah,
better behavior.
right.
There was a great story on the news this morning about a convicted felon who served his time in Florida. I don't know if any of you saw it. He decided that when he got out, he was going to go to college and be a lawyer. And he had studied in the prison library law. And he did that. And now he's working in Florida. The governor there has said that anyone who was a felon cannot vote unless they paid all their fees. And Bloomberg is trying to pay a lot of those fees. And so he is about to make his first vote ever at, I think, the age of 40 or something like that, and is working to help other convicted felons who serve their time and want to be rehabilitated and be part of the good part of society to be able to vote. So I thought that was a fabulous story.
Wow.
I like that.
So what does Bregman say is the problem with the Enlightenment?
Got it wrong. That humans are basically negative and the people are basically greedy. Let me look at my notes here. Sorry, I talked so soon. That humans are selfish. That's what the Enlightenment got wrong.
Right, it was reason. They'll manage things through reason, but the way then that the structures were built were around greed and people not doing what they were supposed to do.
And racism started in at that time.
That brought in racism, right?
I remember being in Amsterdam and looking at a very elegant house, and at the top of the homes there, they indicated what the owner did. So if there was a cow, it was the butcher who lived there. And if it was a doctor, it was the seduceous thing. But this was the picture of a slave. And this was the fanciest house, very, very old, back into the beginning of the Enlightenment. And he was a slave owner and a slave driver.
Wow.
Real powerful. Yeah.
I'm not an expert on slavery, but I have the impression that good people have always engaged in the practice of slavery, in part because they're telling themselves that it's for the benefit of the slave class. It's not just for my benefit. Oh, of course I benefit, but it's really to help them in terms of civilization and finding virtuous means for their work and so on. Until 1865, the Southern Christian elite and even beyond said that not only is this based on biblical principles, chattel slavery in America, but it's really for their own good because we're Christianity to them.
We're saving them.
We're saving them essentially.
That's an interesting story. Our daughter Christy worked in South Africa just after apartheid fell apart. And she was in a position to have house help and kind of refused to do so. But the people, I'm sorry about that. The people who were there said that it was kind of an obligation to help, to have house help, to give them an income. So it was that's kind of a not slave story. It was after slavery was let go in South Africa, but
the other thing, this part of it that I thought was really kind of hard to understand was this idea that once we settled, we had to come up with this idea of the mythical God, the vengeful God, to keep everyone in check, right? Because the people are all bad. And then God went out of the picture when faith in the state. So God, the belief in a vengeful God decreased when we increased, the rule of law came in, and we increased this idea of faith in the state. What did you guys think of that?
It's around 247.
Thank you. Yeah.
God lost his job to bureaucrats is the line on 247.
Yeah.
So I haven't gotten that far in the book yet, but I do think it's amazing how much just negative association people out there have with God or faith or people of faith. I mean, it's just really, really sad. They have these ideas of a God that are just, that is as you said, like, not open, welcoming, understanding. And then faith wrapped around it as like, we will tell you the answers. It just is really sad. That's how the majority of people think about faith in the US.
Mm-hmm.
wow.
Yeah.
And if something bad happens to you and God is angry at you, other things of that kind.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find my notes, but I can't.
Right. This idea of God, God was a myth. God was, this idea of a mythical God was because you couldn't keep your eyes on everybody, because people became settled and the group sizes became so much larger. You didn't know people. You had to keep sight of everyone. So you had to create these rules to know, even though they weren't in your sight, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing.
The Enlightenment came about, not long after
Response to that.
the Protestant Reformation, and Martin Luther had this two kingdom theory, the idea that the church's kingdom is responsible for people's souls, the spiritual aspect, but that God has established this other kingdom, the civil order, and appointed kings and other potentates and leaders and so on to maintain order. So God certainly keeps an eye on our souls through the church, and then God keeps civil order by sending kings and armies and so on. Both of them are very negative views of human beings, that somebody's got to keep an eye on us spiritually and in terms of our wanton misbehaviors in society.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with Christy. I think a lot of people still view God as being a controlling role. And, kind of like the cosmic Santa Claus, watching us when we're naughty and when we're nice. and to send us rewards if we do well and punishments if we do badly. So I think we have a mix of both authoritarian state and authoritarian religion, that both of which tend to mistrust the human beings who might just want to use their freedom for good. Because you just can't trust people. They're going to be, even the best plans of human beings are going to eventually wind up in chaos unless there's some kind of heavy hand controlling, guiding, directing, restraining. And he makes that comment about the US Constitution being a product of the Enlightenment too. And that's how I learned the Constitution. It's kind of a check on people's inherent desire to control other people. And the checks and balances of the US Constitution and the federal system, where you have local control and federal control kind of always being in a constant tension, in check with each other, and the Electoral College and 2 houses of Congress and all that stuff, and 3 branches, that these are all delicate balances because human beings left to their own devices will inevitably eat each other. Anyone else?
And then his argument is that pessimism about human beings is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And what if we
Kind
had
of says that, but there's a part of me that thinks he's a little bit idealistic.
More about that.
Yeah, we had on this trip that we took, this driving trip out west, we had 2 different instances of people who both would tend to support more liberal social causes. And both of them had run into a situation where they could not find people to work on their home because people had money from the stimulus bill and were choosing not to work. So that, and it was 2 separate people, both of whom we feel politically totally in accord with and whatever, but the fact that they had this experience sort of speaks to another side of humanity from what our author is saying.
I'm not quite sure. So when you say that people had stimulus, so they chose not to work?
They had stimulus money.
Right. So
And
is that a problem?
or
Yeah,
unemployment money?
I'm sorry? I don't
Yeah,
see that
Unemployment money.
on its face. I don't see why that's a problem. We don't know the details behind it. They may have someone who is immunocompromised at home, and they don't want to take the risk of bringing disease home to their loved one who could then die. And they're given the stimulus to do with, I think, as they choose to do. Are you seeing it differently? I'm not sure I understand.
that could be, but I guess it was maybe through a contractor that the contractor couldn't get, he was unable to find people to work for him because.
Well, I'm sorry. I probably would choose not to work either.
So
I'm
they
just trying
ascribe it
to
to
point out that there are multiple ways to look at every situation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, there are.
I think a lot of politically conservative people are against government handouts. That's their term, right? Because it will disincentivize people from working. And I've talked to, conservative friends who, this is their fear about any government program they view that's too generous, is that it's taking people's desire and need to contribute to society. It's taking that away and thus hurting the individual who is not able to develop their own skills and sense of productivity and belonging and contributing to society. And it's hurting society because we don't get the benefit of those contributions. And so that's why they're very skeptical of unemployment benefits that are too generous.
Too
That's,
too generous in their opinion. Right. I mean, these are very complex issues, right?
Mhm.
It's not just one issue. These are multifaceted issues.
yes, they are.
Yeah, yeah.
In my neighborhood, we have we have some more conservative people moving in now after the neighborhood for 75 years had been called the quote hippie commune in DuPage County. And so there's a values clash going on. And some of the new people have very, very nice houses. They've built these big, gorgeous houses. And yet the old houses left over from the cooperative days in my neighborhood, they look kind of shabby to them. And so they're kind of saying, don't you want to clean up that house? And, and people say, well, we just have a clash of values here. It's like what we see you wanting is to be able to sort of have guns in your house. And we're not a neighborhood that has had guns until you moved in. There's just mutual suspicion on both sides about values, about liberty and what it means to sort of live your own life.
Well, that was kind of the conversation that we're having is sort of this idea of the Pygmalion effect he talks about and the Gollum effect, that they're both happening around us, right? So your friends might have felt that people were using it for a negative purpose, their stimulus, where Diane, you were more willing to see, well, that's serving a positive purpose for those people, and that it's happening in different ways all around us. That people are, they're looking at things differently.
Mhm.
Well, and how you look at it is shaped by your experience with it, right? So I may not have had the same experience as you, and so we may not see eye to eye on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
Can we talk about play a little bit?
Yeah,
Sure.
Oh, that was
The
amazing.
Homo ludens.
I want to see Christy pull her kids out of school and let them go and see what happens. Have her be our WCC experiment.
I'll send them to your house and you can do whatever you want with them.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, Christy, when you get to this part to see what your reaction is, particularly in this time of COVID, because it made me think of all these articles that you see where people are saying, oh, parents, take the pressure off. Don't worry about making sure they're continually attached to the Zoom or doing X or doing Y. Let them play. They'll catch up, where, like, I'm sure your kids are feeling this too, Jane, to keep their kids on track and doing their stuff. And you read this, what he's talking about play and how important play is in an unstructured way. You think, oh, well, wait a minute.
I think 4 of us here have had children go through the Winnetka Public Schools, and I think there's an aspect of play that is very much a part of the progressive approach, that child directed approach to learning. So I feel very fortunate that our children had that that kind of elementary school education.
I feel like it was sort of play light, though, compared to what he's talking about here. I mean, this seems very radical to me, and maybe pretty interesting for somebody to try out, but I'm not sure I'd want to do it with our kids.
There was something called the Junkyard Jungle
Mm-hmm.
in Winnetka, and it was part of the thing.
Really?
Kids, yes, and
Really?
just north of the ice skating rink in that area. And it was an actual park district thing. You could just go and play in the junkyard. And my daughter did it and she loved it. But then they decided that there could be liability issues and they had to close it down. And that's something that's happened, I think.
That's exactly what the book said too.
In society, absolutely. liability issues, things where people are so scheduled, they got to go to soccer practice, and then they got to go to the music lesson, and then they got to do their homework, and they got to do this and that. They just don't have that freedom just to go out and exist and learn how to get along together on a regular basis.
So
I don't know when that changed, but it's sure different when I grew up.
there's a quote
will
here.
say- oh,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Christy. Go ahead. No, please.
I will say that, my kids are like super scheduled, right? Like they have this class or that sport or this, they're studying for their ACTs and they're doing all kinds of crazy things. But their favorite thing that they all do is go to sleepaway camp for 2 weeks in Wisconsin, where they can't take a phone, they can't do anything. They go on these camping trips and they get in a canoe and they have to figure out, we ran out of water, how are we going to make more water? Like we have to figure this out. And so, that still exists, that like need to get along and survive and to play kind of and figure things out. And, there's an annoying kid in my cabin, and we finally just stole all his shoes and told him until he gets along, he's not getting his shoes back. And, they've had that kind of experience, and it is their favorite. It is definitely their favorite.
That's
Way
only
over,
weeks.
yeah.
That's
My-
really interesting to hear you say that, Christy.
Mhm.
It's way better than, the sports they're on and the things we've signed them up for and their classes. And, this has much more of an impact. Like when my junior is thinking about college essays and stuff, this is the stuff he's thinking about writing about.
Yeah, I saw that a little bit with Maddie. Maddie and Dave have a place up in kind of due north of where you were saying you are, Diane, in Wisconsin. They're over the border though in Wisconsin. It's like 60 acres. And when COVID came out, they took the family because they weren't going to school and went up there and stayed there on that land until school started in the fall. And when they first got there, the boys were very, I miss my screen, my screen time, my friends, my this, my that. But as the summer wore on and they were able to shed some of that, they enjoyed being out in the woods and finding things to do and making up their activities. And now it was the best summer ever. So it takes a little practice maybe from generally how we structure things to allow people that freedom.
This junk junk playground on 286, 287.
Mhm.
Quote here, better a broken bone than a broken spirit. When my grandson was 6, I took him on a train trip from Chicago to St. Louis, and we stopped in Springfield. Then we got to St. Louis, and we went to this place called the City Museum. I don't know if any of you have heard of it.
Oh.
There,
I was there last year. Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't even know it's still open,
It's
but
amazing.
it's just a junk playground in my memory of it. There are, so I'm looking at it as this, danger zone. So many things could go wrong here is what I'm thinking. There was a place where you kind of crawl on a rope. You're like 3 stories up, you crawl on a rope from one suspended school bus to another suspended school bus. And I'm thinking, he's 6 years old. He could hit his head, he could fall through the rope. And I'm also thinking, where did they get their insurance? And yet it was one of the highlights of our trip and maybe my grandson's childhood.
Yeah, no, definitely. We were just there on a, here, I have a photo.
Do they still have the buses suspended? Oh yeah, there it is.
Wow.
Whoa.
One of my kids had a volleyball tournament in St. Louis last year, and we took the team to this. And I mean, what you can't really tell is like, look at the right here. This is like from this part, this floor, they like jump out the window and go down this slide, and they end up like on the 2nd floor or something crazy, and you can never find them again. Like the moms are like, oh, okay, well, guess they'll show back up. I mean, it's crazy. But they had a blast. It's really cool. It's all junk. There's an old airplane. They had a bus on the roof. Yeah.
Neat.
There's the bus at the top, right?
Yeah, you can see the bus kind of perilously
Yeah, right.
off the edge there.
Mhm.
Oh, that's super. That is so good.
Wow.
It's really cool.
But you know, another thing that's happened, I think, is Christy, you mentioned social media, but also just the news. You know, you hear this kid somewhere was kidnapped. So now you're afraid that every kid that you have anything to do with might be
Yeah.
kidnapped. And so you're just so much more protective, and you feel just the way you did, Jeffrey, when he's climbing through this. What could happen? You think of all the worst things, and yet
Right.
in most situations, things really are not worse. They're really,
I think you feel that way more as a grandparent too than even as a parent. As a parent, you sort of feel responsibility, but as a grandparent, you
we
feel
can look at
double
all of-
responsibility.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
When I was a kid, I'd get in my bike and just go away on a summer day, the whole day, and get into so much that my parents didn't know I was getting into. And most of us survived. And I think part of that is when and where I grew up, but also the fact that I was a boy, not a girl. I think
Yeah.
that extra protection where they're not supposed to do those things, and well, he's a boy, let him go do it. And yet I think it was very important in my development, being able to get myself home. And if the bicycle blew a tire, I had to figure it out. And I was, 5-6 miles from home.
And
That's
you
how
have
we
a cell phone.
Yeah, not in 1965.
But you can't do that now. You'd be
Right.
that parent who let your kid do that. I can't. I mean, I'm with you. I subscribe to that theory, right? Like, kids, go play. But you would be that parent. All the other parents would talk about,
Yeah.
oh, those Schellenbergers, they're not supervised.
Or even call the police and say this is an unsupervised situation. Right?
Yeah.
If that happened recently, didn't somebody was walking a dog or something and the police had to come in? I mean, because somebody called. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey, how does he wrap this up into people are basically good? I mean, sort of the premise of us reading this was we needed something positive.
Well, I think his idea is that people can be trusted. Trust children. If you can trust children, trust your employees,
Yeah.
and maybe pastors, trust your church members. We always think people need guidance all the time. Well, maybe people have the inherent ability to guide themselves, and when they need help, they'll ask. You don't need to offer unsolicited advice. I don't know. There's a lot of the sense of like people can be trusted if you really turn democracies over to the citizens,
Mhm.
leaving democracies in the hands of the bureaucrats and the media elites. I hear some right-wing populism in some of his book, which I think is worth hearing because it is very popular these days, that society's in the hands of the trained class, the MBAs, and the professional politicians and so on. Is this really what Jefferson had in mind? In terms of really turning over the country to the people? Why do we think people can only be led by people who have master's degrees?
Or in the present situation, don't.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows what he has, but anyway.
So
Yeah, I think yeah.
I think what he's saying is people can be trusted. People can be trusted with their own money, with their own thoughts, with their own actions.
But we do need to have some rules. For example, we should stop at a stop sign. If the light turns red, we should stop. And if we do that, then we have trust. And I think trust is another thing that's really important. If we are able to trust one another, then we will continue to be good people.
And he says even in the Agora school, there was some structure.
Yeah.
The students had to meet with their coach once a week. There were some other basic kinds of guidelines.
Right, agreement on who we want to be, right, or the type of
Mhm.
school community or something.
Mhm, mhm.
But also, I think motivation, right? Like you have to be motivated to do the right thing. Because if you're motivated to, I don't know, like if you have a selfish reason for doing something, you might not be motivated to do the right thing.
Mhm.
Or you might see it differently as, well, this is right for me, but it may not be right for everyone.
Mhm.
Anything else on today's pages?
I think the question of motivation is a good one. I think that particularly with, there's some self-starters and there are others who aren't self-starters. And I guess my question is, how are people who are not self-starters encouraged to become self-starters? And under the system he's proposing.
He calls it intrinsic motivation.
What's coming to mind in my head right now about motivation is like our teachers in Glenview. So we have back in school or hybrid model, and I think like 85 to 90% of the kids are back, but only 60% of the teachers are back, and they're not motivated to be back. There's not a reason that they have to be there. They can do their job from home, but it's not. The parents are kind of feeling like it's not the same situation if their teacher isn't there. So you have like a classroom full of kids zooming with their teacher. It's like, but the motivation's not there because they have a legitimate reason to be home, and they're getting their full salary, and the ones who are coming in aren't getting more pay or anything, and so it's hard. It's hard. They're not motivated to.
Very hard.
Or are they fearful? I mean, is it the virus that's keeping them home?
Oh, yeah.
And they have family that might be infected. I mean, this is a terrible time.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think that there's legitimate reasons for teachers to have to stay home, but 40% is a lot. That's
It
a
is
lot
a
more
lot.
than.
A lot of retiring, though, I heard yesterday. They're just plain retiring, and we're going to have a real shortage of good teachers.
Chuck feels very happy to have retired from Northwestern when he did, because it's tough times
Yeah.
for teachers. Really tough for teachers. I think it's really even more tough for administrators who are trying to find teachers to cover those teachers who are either retiring or pulling back. I mean, it's not easy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bregman seems to be saying, if I'm reading him right, that everyone has intrinsic motivation. You just need to help them find it. And you don't help them find it by saying, here's your path, or you have this path or this path. But don't sit around and just dream about a path that no one has come up with yet. He's saying, no, let people dream, let people be. And maybe the more confining, the more rule-based the system is, the less
Yeah.
freedom they'll have to really find their own way, which is ultimately the only way that they're really going to contribute the most to themselves and others.
Mhm.
Pretty scary, when you've kind of grown up with, obey the 10 commandments and go to church and be a good citizen and fight in the war and think this way about other people, to really take the heavy hand off and say, you figure it out.
It's exciting in a way.
It's exciting, but somehow it's not how,
It takes an adjustment. You have to adjust to it.
what's the
Huge
role of a
adjustment.
pastor then? We're supposed to
Uh-oh.
guide people in the right way. What do you mean there is no right way? Everybody has to make it up. What?
What?
This should be a right way. So that'll
Am I
work for most people, maybe.
Am I remembering correctly that he postulated that there would be less depression
Yes.
if people were able to just kind of play and figure it out by themselves and not have that guidance?
Yeah.
He quotes bottom of page 294, a psychologist named Brian Sutton Smith. The opposite of play is not work. The opposite of play is depression.
Mhm.
I thought that was very interesting.
I agree.
Well, thank you for a stimulating conversation today.
Very good.
Hey,
Christy, glad to have you
thanks
with
for
us.
joining.
Yeah, it was
We
great
love
to
having
see
you
you,
with us.
Christy.
Thank you.
We
Thank
will
you.
wrap it all up and come to consensus and full understanding next week.
May I ask a question? This is kind of on topic, but a little off topic. We're talking about doing a book, proposing a book for the congregation to read in anticipation of what we might want to do from a racial perspective. Do you think people would respond more to more sessions with fewer pages? Or, how many pages do you think people should be asked to read between sessions? If they're, would it be better to have more pages in 4 weeks or fewer pages in 6 or 8 weeks? Any thoughts?
Fewer pages
In more weeks?
and more weeks would be my thought.
Okay. Anybody else?
I think if you spread it out like a longer amount of time, then the chances of somebody popping in here or there, scheduling wise, they might be able to make 1 or 2, whereas they may not, if you only have 2 or 3 sessions, they might miss all of them.
Okay.
I think it'd be good to make them independent of each other too, so that if you miss one, I think Jeffrey's idea of if you can't come to all of them, don't worry about it, come to what you can and have the sessions structured in such a way that people would feel like they're not hopping in on the 3rd or 4th week of something, if that's what they were able to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I also lean towards fewer pages, more weeks, but I mean, it shouldn't go on like forever.
Right. Okay. Thanks. That's good input.
I tend to think things with a tighter time frame are easier to grasp. Like, we're going to read this book in a month rather than over 2 months, but that's me. Nancy, you were going to add?
I'm sorry, can you hear? I have someone leaving me a long message that I need to listen to, but one of the things that I'm finding, and Christy knows this, and Jean and Jeffrey as well, that through prayer ministry, I'm in connection with one of the members of the Bethel Baptist, and we pray together every other week on Thursday mornings. And from time to time, she joins us in prayer ministry. And one of the things that I'm finding for those of you on the committee that is going to be a difference between us is the difference between Baptist and a liberal church. And so that might be something that we need to explore. And actually, I know I'm going to be seeking guidance on that, because I don't want to step off in the wrong direction. So it's just something for those of you who are in a leadership position on our connection with Bethel Baptist. That's raising questions in my mind. Don't want to do the wrong thing.
Thanks to both of you, Jean and Junior, for doing that, working with Leanne. It's pretty exciting to see that group take off.
All right. Thank
Okay,
you, Jeff.
folks, be well. Have a good day, good week.